Our last session of the day today is called Built to Last, Resilience in Every Retrofit. We have our panelists up on stage, and I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for this final session, Susanne DesRoches.
Hi, everyone. Oh, look at that. You all got very quiet. Thank you. Am I loud enough? Can you hear me in the back? We've been told to be loud. That is not a problem for me usually, but we'll just make sure. If you can't hear, just start waving from the back. So 2 years ago at this conference, we brought together a group of resiliency experts to talk about policy and guidance. And when Ellen and I were talking about what we should do around decarb and resilience, I said, well, we should actually find out what's happening on the ground. So I got together an amazing group of women up here on the stage, very excited about that, to talk basically in 4 main areas: design, construction, insurance, and the legal aspects of climate resiliency. Right? When we're talking about building solutions for climate change, a lot of us in the room are focused on how do we decarb, right? Like, this is hard enough. But basically, climate has already changed around us, right? I often am saying, you know, the future that the climate scientists promised us is here, and it continues to change. And while we're making this once-in-a-generation investment in decarb, we have to do it to the future standards of weather, right? We can no longer be looking backwards at what the weather used to be, and we have to look forward as to what the climate will be across a number of different aspects of how we're going to adapt the built environment. So I'm going to do a really brief intro of everyone sitting up here, and then we're just going to have a conversation. And then we'll open it up for your questions at the end. So I'm going to start all the way down at the end. We have Ilana Judah. She is known to many in the room. She is America's Climate and Sustainability Services Leader at Arup. So for folks who don't already know Ilana, she has about 25 years of experience in the built environment. She has a career as a practicing architect, but really has been specializing in sustainability and resilience for a long time, leading everything from risk assessments all the way through design and construction as part of her work at Arup. Sitting next to her, an old friend from the mayor's office in the last administration, we worked together. Talley Burley is at EDF now. She leads work on climate risk and insurance. We don't often talk about that, but insurance drives a lot of our decision making in investment and in the built environment, and she is leading work around initiatives to build equitable access and assurance affordability in a changing climate. She, as I mentioned, she most recently worked at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, also at New York City Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery and Operations, and has been in this world a long time as well. Sitting next to her, this is nice. You're all sitting in the list order, making my job easier. Is Jessica Mederson. Fun fact for the room, Jessica and I are childhood friends, sort of coincidentally are now both in climate resilience, which is a lot of fun. And she comes here from the Midwest, which I'm sure she'll talk about, not being a native New Yorker. She is a partner at Stafford Rosenbaum, LLP. She litigates business matters in state and federal courts across the United States. She focuses on construction and manufacturing disputes, uniform commercial code litigation, contract disputes, all kinds of different litigation, and is a co-host and co-producer of the podcast Adaptate, Climate Change in the Built Environment with Mónika, who is now sitting to my left. Sorry, I'm just trying to make this a little bit entertaining for everyone. Mónika Serrano is principal and founder at Adaptate LLC. She had 20 years of experience in the construction industry. She led Turner Construction's resilience program and a pioneering study on heat exposure in construction. She serves on many advisory boards. You heard her name earlier as part of the U.S. Green Building Council, as well as National Institutes of Building Sciences and U.S. Resilience Council. So I am thrilled to have this conversation with all of these esteemed women up here. And we're going to start with sort of big picture, right? So we're going to have this conversation in three areas. One, what are the biggest shifts that you've seen in the last decade when we're talking about the integration of climate risk into the built environment? And then what are we seeing on the ground today, and what are we going to see in the future? So I'm going to sort of break the conversation up that way. And then as you're thinking about questions, please feel free to put them into the, whatever we're calling that, chat thing. So I'm going to start with Mónika to my left. So thinking about the biggest shifts that you've seen over the past decade in this space.
Can you hear me okay? I think the biggest shift I have seen in the last decade is the availability of climate data, including data that includes future climate estimates. Some of it is free. Some of it you can go to a couple of websites tonight and put your address and know what hazards are likely to affect your home or your workplace or construction site. And also the use of this data. We know for a fact that there are portfolio developers and investors evaluating this data. So I think this is something that I definitely was not seeing 10 years ago.
My turn?
Yep.
Wait, is this on? Ooh, it is. So yes, I live in Wisconsin now. I've been all over, but I've been in Wisconsin for almost 15 years. One of the big things I noticed, I love my flyover country, but we do tend to be a bit behind the times on some of the climate change things in two ways. I live in the liberal bubble of Madison, Wisconsin, but there the focus always was, yes, go green, go sustainable, we're great, farm to table kind of thing. But the thought about us needing to adapt for climate change was not something that people were thinking of in the Midwest. They worried about sea level rise, worse hurricanes, but they weren't thinking about us in Wisconsin. And I think that mentality is starting to change. The other part is a lot of my clients are construction clients from the Midwest who tended not to care or even really believe in climate change. But I will tell you, even there, they have realized that they need to start changing things. And some of that, I actually give mass timber some credit, right? My concrete clients, they didn't care about cradle to grave or cradle to gate until mass timber started to make some inroads. And all of a sudden they're like, oh wait, this is something we need to work on. And then I'll talk about this later. I try to scare them other ways too, to make them at least focus on the adaptation side.
Well, I'm going to answer somewhat selfishly because insurance being a part of the climate conversation has been a massive shift, not just in the past decade, but really the past couple of years. I think there's a deeper recognition now more than ever that the ways that we think about the adaptation of our built environment are directly connected to our financial and economic resilience. And then is largely driven by the fact that we are seeing, all of us in the news, the emerging insurance crisis happening around this country. We are seeing places like Florida, Louisiana, and California where insurance is no longer available in some cases. And for a lot of us, our insurance prices rising. That is driven specifically by the fact that there are more intense and frequent climate-related events. And so insurers are seeing more claims, they are seeing them more frequently, they are seeing them at a larger scale and a larger size, and that is straining the market and then leading to constrictions in the market. Insurance underpins all other financial activity in this country. You can't get a mortgage without getting insurance. You can't buy a car without getting insurance. The number of places it pops up is staggering once you start to count it. And it is also the primary resource that all of us rely on when something bad happens. That is our financial backstop, is the first line of financial defense. And so as we're seeing insurance become much less available and affordable, I think there is now this deeper recognition that the ways that we build and think about adaptation are directly tied to that economic and financial health, to the point where people are really promoting their adaptation activities by pointing to the potential advantages it has to lower insurance costs and make insurance more available.
So I think the thing that I've noticed in the past 10 years is that we're starting to move from reacting to things that have occurred and to codes that are sort of responding to those events, to starting to think in a future forward way. And thinking about, and part of that is supported by the data that Mónika was referring to. There are frameworks now, ESG frameworks, for example, where there's a requirement to be thinking about future risk. There are data providers that are now providing sort of downscaled projections for various hazards. And I think the mindset now is moving towards not just reacting to what has happened or to an event, but what could potentially happen. And that mind shift of the probability of something happening is the major shift that I've seen.
That's great, thank you. So I want to pivot to what we're seeing on the ground, because I want to spend enough time on this. I think folks in the room probably want to know what you all are seeing in this industry that they should take into consideration. So I'm going to start with you, Ilana. I know that Arup just published a new taxonomy around climate risk and resilience, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what a building owner or developer should do really to get started when they're, and this has come in also in some of the questions, like how do people get started, right? There's a lot of guidance out there around decarbonization. We've got local law 97 locally. If folks are looking to start to integrate climate risk, where do they start?
You can come to us. No, I'm just
I did not set that up for that.
I sort of think about it as like you want to do a diagnosis, right? A lot of people come to us when they're thinking about investing in a property or purchasing a property as part of their due diligence process or a site that they're potentially building on. So the most important thing to start with is to understand what the sort of potential vulnerabilities and exposure is of your property, of your site, or of your development. And so before you can even act, right? So it's really sort of that fundamental hazard exposure, if it's an existing property or an existing site, what are those vulnerabilities, what's the topography, how old is the building, what code were they built to, and really looking at combining what we call the vulnerabilities of the site with the exposure to the various hazards, and also, again, that future data. If you are holding that property for 10 years or selling it to somebody who's going to hold it for another 10 years, you want to be looking out for 15, 20 years to understand what the possible implications are from a consequence perspective. And we can measure those consequences either based on damage, which is what most people think of, but often what most people ultimately get concerned about is downtime or continuity of their operations and the implications around that, whether that they be cost of business or if they're an institution like a healthcare facility, are there implications to that downtime. So doing that diagnosis to truly understand what are the potential consequences if they are investing in a property, and then from there they can start to make decisions around what they need to do.
That's great. Mónika, pivoting from design to construction, if you could talk a little bit about the sort of biggest challenges you see in the construction industry right now, really as it relates to resilient buildings, but also materials, processes, what are you seeing sort of catch on?
The biggest challenge, and I think this doesn't only apply to construction and design, I think it crosses other industries, is the fact that resilience is not seen as a need yet. And so until we don't see resilience as a need, we won't implement all these ready solutions, because there are solutions out there that can be implemented today. And so it's the one is that we don't see resilience as a need. And then two, we human beings are not wired to prepare for disasters. And just stick with me here. There's a book that talks about it called the ostrich paradox, but you don't have to read it because there's a great one-page summary out there. But anyway, and I'll tell you just a quick snippet. It doesn't make us bad people that we're not wired to prepare for disasters, because the world we used to live in didn't change constantly. We now live in a world that is changing drastically. And so our original wiring, we tend to forget the effects of different disasters. We're optimists by nature, and we tend to do what everybody else is doing. So all of this is playing against us today because we're not preparing for disasters as fast as we should. But once we have this knowledge, we can now shift our mindset, right? And start thinking, hey, there's gonna be disruptions, we have to prepare for them, and then resilience will become a need. So there's a challenge, but there are solutions, and we have done this before. We all brushed our teeth this morning, right? This didn't happen in the late 1800s. And it is an investment in the long term, right? Because you don't see the ROI of brushing your teeth tomorrow. So we are capable of doing this. So we have a big challenge across many industries, but we can overcome it.
That's a great example. I will definitely keep that one in the back pocket. Jessica, so thinking about the legal perspective, and maybe if you have any examples. So, where are you seeing climate risk come up in the litigation that you're involved in?
So this is a challenge because I focus on the adaptation side. And so a lot of the climate change related litigation everyone sees is about suing oil companies, or I think it's the youth in Montana who sued for the right to clean air under their constitution, things like that. In my world, we're talking about the impact that climate change could have either during the construction process or with the final building. And in fact, that's how I came into this space in the first place, was actually an infrastructure project that was being worked on in Wisconsin back 2016, 17, 18. We had two 500-year flood events in 2018, which basically caused a failure of the infrastructure system that probably would have happened over the long term, but it wouldn't have been discovered for 10 years or something. And it was actually as I was working with engineers who talked about, this could have been related to climate change. So those kinds of problems related to either, supply chain delays caused by climate change, just a slower build process because of more extreme weather events or flooding or extreme heat, those are tougher to track. But unfortunately, the canary in the coal mine for some of this litigation that we're going to start seeing, and certainly legal issues around, are the workers themselves, right? I mean, we've seen that in the Texas and Florida in particular. We know there have at least been some workers who have actually died directly as a result of extreme heat. Both Florida and Texas a few years ago, there were cities who tried to pass laws to give some protections to those workers. Ironically, Texas tried to pass this Death Star legislation to prevent its liberal cities from doing this kind of thing, but actually the Texas Constitution prevented the Texas legislature from doing that, because they said there's actually the cities have certain rights that the legislature can't overrule. Unfortunately, Florida didn't have that. So Florida, the state, was able to prevent cities from addressing that. But I think that's an area that we're going to see more of first, which also ties into insurance, because that's a big worker comp issue, obviously. The other thing that we're starting to see a few cases of are cases involving climate modeling and whether people should or shouldn't be using climate modeling when they're looking at big projects. So there have been a couple lawsuits over that where courts have seemed open to the idea of, yeah, you know, it is reasonable. In North Carolina, there was one lawsuit where city council didn't let a developer build a new development because he wasn't taking into account the impact climate change would have, specifically flooding and actually safe ingress and egress, because this is Carolinas, you know, hurricanes, you have to be able to get out of there. And the court actually upheld the city council saying, no, we're looking at climate modeling data and we don't think this is a good idea.
That's great. Thank you for those examples. Talley, so this is going to be a little bit of a 101 for folks in the room, including myself, because I'm definitely not an insurance expert. So how do insurers think about climate risk today, that what you're seeing, and then, you know, we'll talk a little bit about where you think this is going. But how does it get incorporated into evaluation and pricing?
This is like the most important question right now within this space. We're hearing a lot from local governments, from individuals, state governments, community organizations that are pointing to, we did all of this amazing adaptation work and we're not seeing that rewarded or reflected in our insurance. Either the price of insurance is staying the exact same, it might be going up. If you're in a place where insurance is not very available right now, you might still be having difficulty finding and maintaining insurance. And a lot of this comes back to a need for a deeper understanding, kind of both from insurers around how they are thinking about climate risk and risk generally, the type of data that they need and need to understand, how they think about projects, but also how do we get that data from the communities, from the work that they are doing into the hands of insurers. So we talk a lot in the insurance space about insurance being a price signal. And I think that we're starting to see that be not really an accurate phrasing. In theory, the more you pay for insurance, the riskier the thing that you are having insured. That holds some truth. That's certainly accurate to a degree, but that also relies on you as the customer understanding what that price even means in the first place. So you need a lot of information to understand what's going into that price. You need to understand what the people around you are paying for insurance. And then you need to understand what are the things that I should be able to do to lower my insurance. There is not a very good way right now, I'm just gonna underscore, to like pick the 5 things that you should do to your property to lower your insurance and make it available. That's just not true. So how are insurers actually even thinking about pricing then? Climate is certainly a huge piece of that. They use a lot of catastrophe models that are proprietary. I think Jess's point around like the climate modeling and all of that, we're seeing that in the insurance space too. Should these models be public? Should they be available? What's the data that's going into them? There are a lot of questions. A model is just a model. A model is only looking at certain things. And insurers don't insure for all different types of climate hazards. If we look across the country, places like the Southeast, it is difficult to get wind insurance. It is often a separate policy. Out in California, earthquakes tend to be separate insurance policies run through the state of California's California Earthquake Authority. And I think for this room, as we think about flood risk and being in New York City, the National Flood Insurance Program exists because there is not really a large private sector flood insurance market. Flood is largely excluded, and so we all get federally backed flood insurance. And so when they're looking at climate hazards, it's like this little snapshot of like, what are the things that I am covering? What are the risks based on the types of hazards I'm covering? And if you're doing really amazing work, say putting in flood adaptation strategies in your community, you're never going to see that reflected in the price that you pay for your homeowner's insurance. You might see it in the price paid for flood insurance. I will just like put a couple of notes out there too to just make this more complicated really quickly before I get to some like happy examples, which is that insurers are really focused on avoided losses and damages. They are really focused on how many claims they are going to get, of what size and what scale. And that means risk from everything. They are looking at every possible point that a building could have a failure and where they might have to pay out damages. I live in a really old building in Brooklyn, and a year ago we had a really hard time renewing our insurance policy, not because we had climate hazard, but because we had outdated electrical systems that posed a building fire risk. So we had to have the electrical systems upgraded. They also account for things in pricing like inflation, supply chain issues, and so those things all add to the price of the policy. We are starting to see a place where we're having a lot more cross-communication between local governments, community organizations, and insurers that I think are paving the way for us to have a better understanding collectively of how is risk thought about, what are the solutions, and how to begin kind of building adaptation in a way that is both resilient to the future and also insurable. To end on the positive example, because I swear, I told people I wouldn't be doom and gloom up here, so I promise there are some happy things. The town of Paradise, California, which was devastated by the Camp Fire in 2018. There's a wonderful documentary from a few years ago that I recommend if you want to learn more about what happened in Paradise. They did all of the things that we point to. They adopted stronger building codes, land use regulations. Wildfire is messy because it's really about like the community level resilience that needs to happen. And they were still struggling to find insurance and find insurance affordably. Working with the Insurance Institute for Building and Home Safety, IBHS, they were able to then also start having conversations with the insurers. And as of the end of last year, an insurer has finally re-entered the insurance market in Paradise and has begun offering home insurance policies again. And so I think that like shows an example of like there's hope. There are ways for us to do that. And I think there are ways for us to kind of begin better understanding how insurers are thinking about risk. So it's not just people like me doing 101s.
Thank you. That was definitely, you ended that on a positive note. So continuing the positivity, you know, it is obviously an evolving landscape, right? So the big difference between doing climate resiliency work and doing decarb work is that the goalpost just continues to move, right? The climate is changing. The speed at which the climate is changing depends on how quickly we decarbonize. There's, you know, obviously a linkage, but the climate is going to be changing for the foreseeable future, right? So what we want to try to do today is talk through some really concrete examples of what we see is coming so that you all, in your day-to-day life as you're trying to decarb all the buildings in New York City, New York State, et cetera, have this in the back of your mind and know that there are tools and resources out there that can help you navigate this space. So I'm going to start with Ilana, because we're going to kind of do the design, construction, insurance, and litigation sort of trajectory is how I think about it. So what standards are out there that you're using for climate resiliency? And are there gaps that you see are starting to be filled in? And when I say standards, I mean, you know, the whole gamut: codes, standards, guidance. You know, what is out there that folks are using?
Is this on? Okay, yeah. So maybe I'll start with just giving kudos to the New York Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines as a really wonderful reference point. And I know that a couple of you folks worked on that here on the stage. I think one of the things that we've seen with regards to resilience is that there's such variability around the standards, right? Every jurisdiction has a different code. Some are great with wind, some are better with flood, some are better with seismic. And so it's really about how do you navigate and understand what to use. And what I really appreciate about the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines is that it enables sort of a benchmark for city agencies and beyond to really at least have a consistency across how they're working together, because I think somebody mentioned earlier, it's not just about what you do for your building, it's also what your neighbor does and what, you know, your community is doing. So I think we draw from a whole range of standards. The City of Boston has some great flood standards as well in specific neighborhoods. Somebody mentioned IBHS, so Institute for, you mentioned that. So they have a standard called the Fortified Standard, which is for extreme wind and with some flood. And then they've just developed a wildfire standard at the community scale. And their standard is particularly interesting, I would say, because it is for smaller buildings, so it's not necessarily for large high-rise buildings. But what it has done is there's been a linkage between insurance. So if you get a fortified certified home or roof, and you're located in a particular state, in the Southeast in particular, there is, an insurance benefit that you can obtain if you have a fortified home. There's also been workforce development for, verifiers and those who are trained and contractors. And then the other piece is the legislation piece that mandated basically a discount, and you'll probably know more about this. So I think, some of the value in the standard is also being able to link it to all of these other parts and pieces, the incentives, those who know how to implement it. And of course, there are all kinds of references out there. FEMA has developed over the years very specific technical guidance. Arup, we have our own resilient design standard called READY. So there are lots out there. I think the thing that I would emphasize is we need a consistency in the market around standards, so that folks like insurers can say, oh, you've got a fortified roof or a fortified building or whatever that standard is, and they can, if there's been a third-party certifier, and they can check that box, and then that can link to a benefit to the owner. And I think that's what we really need more of right now in the market.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thinking a little bit more on the building retrofit example, Mónika, what kinds of strategies are you seeing that can be implemented over time, right? So we talk about phased decarbonization. That's come up in a couple of times in other panels. So while we're doing that work, what can we be doing on resiliency?
So I'll give two parts to my answer. One is for the actual building retrofit, and then one for the construction phase. So for the building retrofit, resilience, it's challenging to quantify the benefits of resilience. So when you pair it with sustainability, it becomes very effective in a way. So for instance, when you're retrofitting your windows, right, to comply with Local Law 97 or to make sure your fines are not that high, you are really addressing both resilience and sustainability. Resilience to heat, for example. Nature-based solutions are also one that will address both resilience and sustainability. So from a green roof that will lower the heat of the building to shade, trees, permeable paving, that will address both resilience and sustainability. So I find that those are very effective measures. Moving to the construction phase and focusing on heat, because I'm very passionate about that topic, and it's one that affects everybody. And I'll preface this with saying construction phase is a pretty vulnerable phase. In the life of a building, it's just a tiny, tiny little piece. But a construction site can be more vulnerable than the finished building. In fact, it usually is. And somebody mentioning how the building affects the community. Imagine a big hole next to a bunch of other buildings and how that can affect nearby buildings. And in fact, it has happened. And so you have to plan the construction phase thinking about what are the hazards that may affect the site, the workers, the actual site, the buildings nearby that may not be covered in the insurance of your construction site. So that pre-planning is really necessary. Going to the topic of heat, there are some measures that can be pretty effective, like shade. I think shade just doesn't get enough credit. There was a study out there that said that depending on the density of the shade, it can feel 5 to 20 degrees cooler under the shade. So shade is one of those measures during the construction phase that really, there has to be there has to be some shade. There has to be shade where the workers are taking breaks, where perhaps some work is happening and you can just put a shade over. And it's really, shade is one of 3 mitigation strategies for heat that are key. It's shade, hydration, and breaks. And again, I think hydration gets the most attention, which is great, but you really need all 3. Hopefully I answered the question.
That's great, thank you. Talley, so thinking again about examples around where we're seeing the insurance industry go, how can folks be aware, and knowing that not everybody in the room is involved with the insurance aspects of their projects, but some developers and building owners are, where should they be looking to get a sort of more robust insurance product that can help rebuild stronger and greener in the future?
Yeah, so at EDF, one of the things that we've been looking into is very specific to what are the ways that insurers can incentivize and support and potentially require greener and more resilient construction. We've been looking really in the post-disaster space, in part because insurers are really engaged in post-disaster process. People are submitting claims, so you're already talking to your insurer more than you would at any other point in time. What we have been looking into is something referred to as an endorsement. This is essentially like an additional rider coverage that could be added to a policy. It is a type of policy that's already used by the insurance industry pretty readily, but they can be used in kind of interesting ways, like providing additional money on top of your claim to help pay for additional activities. In the insurance space already, in the private sector, we see a fair number of kind of green or eco endorsements that provide some additional funding post-disaster to help people install energy efficient equipment, rebuild with green building materials. They often come at an additional cost, so your policy is more expensive and you have to opt into them. And so people don't really necessarily know that they're there and to ask for them. So is there a lot of data and are these actually being used? I think that's a bigger question that needs to be explored further. What is interesting is that we don't see a ton of resilient-related endorsements. These are starting to emerge, and Ilana mentioned the IBHS fortified standard. And just to put in a plug for IBHS, one of the reasons why insurers love them is because they test in a facility using prototypes and blow hurricane force winds over and over and over again. So there's lots of data on how these standards perform. And so that has led to the creation of this endorsement in which in some places, especially in the Southeast, you can get a little bit of additional funding as part of your claims process to rebuild with the fortified roof standard. We are also seeing this in these quasi-governmental insurance agencies that some states have that provide coverage for people who can't find it elsewhere. They're offering these endorsements, especially in the Southeast for fortified, that come at no cost, and you are automatically enrolled in the endorsement. Fortified is getting a lot of traction within this space, both pre and post-disaster, just because it is such a well-respected standard that the industry feels comfortable in. Could we expand these types of endorsements to other resilience activities, taking a much more holistic approach to resilience and all of the different types of hazards? I think that is something that we're still trying to explore. Fortified roofs are not that much more expensive than a traditional roof, and so the amount of additional funding on top of the claim is pretty small. But things like elevating a home can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. That is probably cost prohibitive for these types of policies. So we're seeing some interesting movements there, and we're also seeing some interesting movements, I should say, with insurance regulators who are now adopting grant programs to help people before the next disaster happens, especially around fortified. Alabama has kind of really led this effort. I know we don't talk about Alabama a lot, but Alabama has led this effort as starting in 2012 after they had a really significant hurricane and Hurricane Ivan, and they created a grant program that is actually housed out of the Alabama Department of Insurance. We are seeing that model replicated in many states across the country, really focused on Fortify as the starting point. Minnesota now has a Strengthen Minnesota's homes, and New York has a piece of legislation currently that would do a Strengthen New York homes that would also be run through the insurance regulator.
Oh, great examples there. Thank you, Talley. I'm going to ask Jessica this question, but then I'm going to also open it up for Mónika and Ilana also. It's come up in the audience questions, so I think we may have struck a nerve with some folks in the audience. So what legal responsibilities do you think architects, engineers, contractors, and building owners should be considering with relationship to climate change? So I think, that can be a broader group discussion.
Okay, and this I would love to talk about, we could have a whole hour just on that. So I'll try not to go into that, but I will tell you the way I scare my audience, because again, a lot of times, and I will tell you, Mónika and I talk a lot, and it's always very interesting talking to, say, architects and engineers versus like contractors, right? And I describe myself as a ghost of Christmas future, because again, a lot of my clients, especially when we first started doing this, didn't care about climate change, but they also hate lawyers. Like my own clients would tell me all the time how much they hated lawyers and how much they hated paying me. So this came about like, okay, construction litigation is very expensive. It's very time consuming. Usually every party will get dragged if there's some problem during the process or afterwards. I've seen poor little distributors, some mom and pop distributor, dragged into multi-million-dollar litigation just because some of the concrete pavers happen to go through them. So construction litigation, very expensive, very time-consuming. So I started talking to people about how to address adaptation up front, because we can talk about all the ways that climate change can impact, again, both the construction process and the end product. And so I always tell them, I'm like, look, I win either way. Either you accept and start addressing climate change up front, or you hire a litigator like me at the back end. So you choose, pick your poison. But what's kind of interesting and what really has developed is, I mean, especially when we started talking to engineers, I would have engineers say to me, but as long as we follow the local building codes, that's all we have to do, right? And I'm like, no, not anymore. First of all, there are parts of the country that don't have building codes at all. Again, in my beloved state of Wisconsin, the state legislature controls building codes, and they affirmatively refuse to update them. So we're still working with 2015 building codes. At the same time, though, every engineering and architectural group out there has things on their website. I actually found something from the American Society of Civil Engineers that I was presented to a bunch of infrastructure engineers last week about their affirmative duty to start taking into consideration climate change. And there is, in the law, especially for engineers and architects, there is a standard of care that they have to follow, and that is an evolving duty. I think for a lot of people, it's easier to think of this with doctors, right? I think about, I once read a bio on James Garfield, and after he was shot, like every doctor was just poking their finger in the bullet hole, while at the same time, there was this doctor from England who was trying to tell everyone about germ theory, but they didn't know about that, right? And so they were just, it's like torture porn, like poor Garfield should not have died. It was literally the doctors who killed him. Segue, but yeah, it's really sad. But I think about that, like doctors now know about germ theory. Most people now know about germ theory, and that's an evolving standard of care. The same applies to engineers. And Mónika and I actually wrote an article for Structure Magazine a few years ago about the fact that engineers could no longer just point to building codes. And I was actually Googling that the other day, and I found a lot more articles now talking about this. So for engineers and architects, again, you can make some arguments about regional things, you know, what is reasonable for an architect or an engineer in Wisconsin versus New York or Florida, but it's going to get harder and harder for them to avoid their legal obligation to basically their clients for that standard of care. But engineers and architects, kind of like I'm an officer of the court, and I've had to have very tough conversations with clients telling them, I don't care how bad you want to break the law, you can't. And I've told engineers they basically have to have the same conversations. They have an obligation actually to the public, and Ilana can probably talk to that more than I can, but that's part of this climate change discussion as well.
I think the standard of care is a really important question, because often our own insurers, as engineers and architects, insure us. Like if we go, this is a conversation in sustainability and green building too. If you go, you know, beyond the standard of care versus the standard of care in the industry, it's always a sensitive topic. But I think at this point, everybody understands that these issues are happening, whether they agree on what's causing it or not. And so I think there's at minimum an obligation to raise awareness with the client, to send them a letter, send them an email, have a discussion with them on how they would like to address this. Part of that is a discussion about their risk tolerance. You know, that's often governed by the type of facility. You know, there's also if you get into the specific hazards, there's more or less certainty around different types of future climate data. We have more certainty around warming, we have more certainty around flooding, wind, and some of the other hazards. There's a lot more uncertainty. So I think at minimum we should be making our clients aware and having the conversation, and then having them guide us based on that conversation of saying, we don't want to do this or we want to do that, and documenting that. I think that's the minimum we should be doing right now.
And I'll let Mónika talk to the practicalities, but on the contractor side, they usually just have contractual responsibilities. But like I always say, the problem is with most contracts is there's always gray areas, and especially now with regard to maybe taking into consideration climate change related issues. Is that a contractor responsibility, you know, figuring out the site, right? There's every contract I see, the engineer may have done some groundwater testing or something, site condition things, but then every contractor signs off, yes, I've checked the site conditions here and I'm fine with the site conditions. None of them are thinking about fluctuating groundwater levels or anything because of climate change, but they've now taken on that contractual responsibility for being familiar with the site conditions. So contractors, they often will come up to us and say, well, that's not our problem. Like climate change isn't our issue, that's the architects and engineers. So I'm like, number one, you should see what you're agreeing to in these contracts. These contractors often don't know the burdens they're taking on. But number two, if there is confusion, there's usually enough gray area between what is design and what is actually installation for it to take years and possibly a jury someday to decide, is this a contractor problem or is this an architect or engineer problem? And I mean, I tell every single client, you know, juries try so hard, juries are always trying to do their best, but they are not experts in this field. You don't want them deciding who should be doing this.
I learned from Jessica that means and methods means nothing in front of a jury.
Yes.
So I have learned that you have to get it in the contract.
That's right? Yes.
So besides that, I mean, and just to echo what Ilana said, we're all aware of all these hazards. Yes, the certainty of the hazards, we don't know exactly, but as contractors, you know, construction companies really just can't act like they don't know that floods will happen, that heat will happen, that there are vulnerable sites, and that they're not going to prepare for these hazards during the construction site. So I think it's just more efficient cost-wise if you don't want to spend money on litigation, and also reputation, right? To plan for all these hazards. Your name will be on that building that didn't incorporate resilience or something happened during the construction site, right? So I'm echoing again what Ilana said, you have to document these conversations. If a design gets to a contractor and there's no resilience incorporated, contractors cannot longer say, well, it wasn't in the drawings, because it will affect your reputation. There could be lives lost, there could be lives affected. So there's a great tool by the AIA called AIA Hazard and Risk Form. It's just like 4 pages, and it'll take you through the conversation of, do you evaluate future hazards? Do you want to incorporate resilience? Yes or no? And there's even signature blocks for all the team members. So I think tools like that, they're readily available, again.
I'll just add quickly to that. One of the things that we're developing is a resilience OPR to really work with our owners to establish what the owner's project requirements are and how that can get translated into a basis of design. Because it's not just about a project being resilient or not, it's what is it being resilient to, for how long. It's really setting the parameters. Are we just focused on a particular hazard, to what duration? So framing those parameters is really, really critical to the onset of the design.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to end this to tie us back to sort of the decarbonization work that we've heard about earlier. So how can resilience and decarbonization go hand in hand? We're talking a lot in the state about energy efficient electrification. So really, what are some of the strategies that you can incorporate? So I'm going to just open that up to everyone. But maybe Ilana, you want to start.
I'm very excited about this topic. It's Susanne knows.
There's 4 minutes and 56
Susanne
seconds
knows
left.
about this. So one thing I'm very interested in is this question of the intersection of embodied carbon and resilience. When we look at life cycle assessment in terms of embodied carbon, and we look at risk assessment, they tend to be two completely different things. And when you do a risk assessment, you look across a certain time horizon and you determine, what the potential damage is, probability of damage, and the cost of damage, and so forth. And I think that there's an opportunity to think about the embodied carbon savings associated with avoided damage, and that's sort of an interesting modeling exercise. So I'm hoping that Arup will give us a little bit of funding to figure out what that calculation looks like. That's one area. I think the other area is just a simple question of, well, what happens when the power goes out? If we're, I think Gina's panel was talking about this question, battery storage, electrification. How do we solve the problem? That's the fundamental problem is, okay, if we're going to electrify and decarbonize, how do we reduce the risk of power outage? What do we do when that happens? And that makes for a much more efficient and effective design process. And so I think just asking those types of questions that we're kind of working in concert when we're thinking about a design, and that we're not just looking at one versus the other.
That's great. Mónika, did you have anything to add to that?
I think, I'm not sure if I do, but as I was listening to the other panels, I kept thinking that this was very well organized because we talked about decarbonized buildings in the first panel. Then we talked about batteries in the second panel. And it was a great transition into resilience, right? And the point I'm trying to make is if you make this overly efficient, beautiful building and you have a battery, if you don't incorporate resilience in that building, the building will not perform well. So you really have to think about all of these aspects, mitigating climate change, adapting climate change to make sure that you avoid embodied carbon, you keep the building operating as it should, and their occupants are happy and healthy.
Well, I think,
I was going to say one thing, yeah, if I could. Going back to,
it was a very positive note to end on.
Sorry, no.
That's the challenge to you, Jess.
I will say two things. One, I saw again with my first infrastructure project, because it basically failed, it disrupted an entire community and basically ended up doing a ton of work, which generated a ton more embodied carbon, right, to ultimately fix and get this infrastructure project to work. So there's that. And the other thing, I do think resiliency, quite frankly, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, is a way to get into audiences that maybe otherwise aren't thinking about climate change so much. And the great thing about resiliency, at least from my perspective, is that it really doesn't matter what governments at any level are doing, quite frankly, because it really does come down to usually just basic contract law and tort law. So that's why I'm kind of a fan of using this as a way to get people talking about climate change who otherwise maybe aren't. Was that good?
Great point. Yes, very positive. So big round of applause to the panel.